The politics of dialogue and power sharing has acquired particular significance in the wake of the so-called Arab Spring and its backlash. With the return of the deep state in Egypt, the collapse of Syria, and the crystallization of sharp factional cleavages in countries such as Libya and Yemen, scholars have been revisiting the literature on dialogue and power sharing with a view to exploring whether forms of governance based on pluralism would constitute realistic options to mitigate tensions and exit wars. While the theme of conflict management in Arab plural societies has evolved into a key international concern, little do we know in practice about whether, and if so how, power sharing would guarantee peace building in multi-ethnic societies of the Arab world. So this panel takes up the challenging debate on coexistence and dialogue in heterogeneous societies. It furthermore explores whether there is potential to derive lessons and insights from polities such as Bosnia and Northern Ireland, which have undergone in one way or another the path of power sharing by institutionalizing arrangements guaranteeing pluralist forms of politics. It is with great pleasure that I introduce first Professor Theodor Hanf, whose seminal book, Coexistence in Wartime Lebanon, has marked us all, I believe. Professor of Sociology and Honorary Professor of Political Science, former Director of the Arnold Bergstrasse Institute in Freiburg, and of the Centre International des Sciences de l'Homme in Byblos, Professor Hanf has been researching for decades ethnic conflict and the various modes for its regulation. He has published not only on Lebanon, but on other polarized societies such as Congo, Rwanda, Pakistan, and South Africa. Dear Professor Hanf, I look forward to your presentation.
Thanks very much. The subject of the conference is like a sermon in a church or in a mosque. C'est mieux maintenant? Ah oui. The subject of our panel today is very comprehensive. It's like a Grand Mufti speaking about the Holy Quran, or like a priest speaking about the Bible in general. We will have to take a few perspectives to organize the mass of ideas and informations one could put under the heading of this. It doesn't work? Bon, merci. There is one journal in the United Kingdom with the nice name of Race and Class. It has been going on for years to study the problems which we are addressing today. Basically, in the academic world, you have had a flux and a reflux of culturalist ideas and of biologist ideas and of economistic ideas. Until the 80s, things like culture, ethnic groups, and so on were considered by the mainstream academia as outlandish. Now, since the breakdown of the Soviet Union and the multiplication of multi-ethnic states, the fashion is now culturalist. Of course, what really matters is not water, it is blood, is descent. And if you look into the discourse of European populist parties, they have become very much ethnicist. So the question we are dealing with is one which is a real question in many parts of the world. The terminology, of course, is always confusing. A nation, meaning in good Latin, people of the same breed, is not a nation. A nation has been declared a business of determination, of will, of common determination to be something like a nation. Others speak about ethnic groups, which means the same in Greek. And the world is full of societies which are divided in such a way. It's a majority of societies. Only sometimes people choose to ignore these differences. On the other hand, well, a very famous German sociologist by the name of Karl Marx made a very important distinction between a class in itself and a class for itself. And that distinction, we can apply it also not to groups distinguished by economic markers, but by other markers, cultural markers. And there is a whole variety of markers which can be chosen to collect interest, to make a group in itself into a group for itself. And that has happened over and over again. There have been the big waves of the multiplication of diverse states. The first one was the end of World War I, when the Ottoman Empire, the Austro-Hungarian Empire were dissolved, and in the place of great multi-ethnic empires, we got new nations, called them nations. The Austrian writer Roth, he said, yes, these are all new racist little states. And he also hinted to the Marushka game of the Russians, where you have a doll, and if you take the upper part of the doll off, there's the next doll coming, and then the next doll. And the thing is, if you open up a multinational state and you look for the next one, it's smaller, but it is as multinational. So the question how the coexistence between different groups, between groups who see themselves as different, that is the main thing, can be organized. Well, in European history, there have been attempts to unify groups, irrespective of their origin, to create states based on the idea of one people, one nation, sometimes one leader, and some of them succeeded more or less. I have been often asked during the years, I tried to understand Lebanon. What is the difference between Lebanon and France? Well, to be very rude, the difference is that the French managed to kill most of the Protestants and to drive out those who remained alive. In Lebanon, there has, fortunately, never been a serious attempt of ethnic cleansing, which is a neologism coming from the Balkan wars. And the real question is if people enjoy just uniformity or if they enjoy multiplicity, diversity. When we have to talk about dialogue, the head of the Friedrich Ebert Foundation's office here in Beirut, he gave already a very good linguistic interpretation. Dialogue means advancement by the use of words, by talking. Well, those who want uniformity, they don't want to talk. They want to do away with anything somebody wants to say who's not themselves. Dialogue in itself has led only in a limited number of states to political results which are astonishing. The majority of states which ended up with compromises between their various groups, and with some form of power sharing, did so after war. First, you try to kill the other, and once you fail, you have to talk to them. Look, if one takes a look at the map of Europe, at the confessional map of Europe, Sten Rokkan, the Norwegian sociologist, he said, well, basically, we have the north, which is Protestant, we have the south, which is Catholic, and we have some states in the middle where they have tried to drive the others out and where they have failed. And these are the multi-confessional, multicultural states of Central Europe. Power sharing is nothing most political leaders want, and nothing most populations want. They don't want to share power, they want to have power and to keep it. I apologize to the ladies. I'll use one example which has been coined by South African sociologist Van Zyl-Slabbert, which is really, in my view, the best interpretation of how power sharing works. There's a gentleman who has problems with his teeth and lots of pain, and he sees a dentist, and the dentist looks at it and said, we can fix it, but I'll have to drill. Okay, says the patient, do so, doctor. So the doctor comes and starts to open his machine, and then the patient grips the doctor's testicles and says, doctor, we won't hurt each other, won't we? That is power sharing. If we want to avoid to hurt each other, we have to make a deal. It's a very reasonable thing. One can give it nicer cultural connotation, enjoying diversity and so on and so forth. But basically, it is the insight into the fact that you cannot run the place alone. And to be happy with that, to be reasonably happy with such an impossibility to do, to be victorious. There are only few states where the politicians had the wisdom of preemptive dialogue. And they are perhaps the most interesting to look at. This is the Netherlands, and it's Belgium. In all other European cases, there was war before. In most cases, in other parts of the world, it started with war. And only if the war became a pain for all sides, they decided to negotiate. Now, let's shortly look at the Netherlands and at Belgium and see what they have to tell the rest of the world. In the Netherlands, they had very severe ideological disputes before World War I and during World War I, and it was the midst of the World War in which the Netherlands remained one of the few neutral states that they called a conference called pacificatie, a kind of preemptive pacification to define the areas where self-styled communities, be they ethnic, be they linguistic, be they ideological, can organize those things which they ideologically consider as very important on their own. That is the beginning of the system which the Dutch call pillarization. The different pillars, they have their own organizations. They have not only their places of worship, they have schools, they have universities. Until now in the Netherlands you have Protestant and Catholic university and secular universities, all financed by the state. That is, the whole apparatus in social life is completely segmented. But you can always walk over to the other segment. And that's what has happened in the Netherlands over the decades. And that's why the country has never experienced civil strife. Belgium. My Congolese friends, they enjoy themselves always in saying that Belgium is as tribalist as the Congo. It is. But tribalism in Belgium has never killed one single person. And if that is tribalism, qu'il soit le bienvenu. Belgium was an impossible creation of a state which was considered to be a buffer between France and Germany, which didn't help in the end because France and Germany fought their wars on Belgian soil. But they put people with different languages and with different attitudes towards religion into one state. There have been attempts of unifying, of Francisizing the Dutch-speaking majority. It didn't work. So started a process which is remarkable and which can be particularly of interest to the study of comparative law. A process of constant change of the constitution from a central state to a federal state and to a multi-communal state. And all this went with a lot of noise, but no better noise. So the conclusion is very easy. If people see it as interesting to organize themselves as ethnic groups or religious groups and to make this their main reason of existence, the chance that they will run into trouble is very high. If they make a reasonable calculation of the risks and the costs, there is a possibility of a preemptive reason. And that's why I think that Lebanon is happy that it never had a Nuit de Saint-Barthélemy, and it had civil wars, which ended with the insight that some people could win and others could lose, but nobody could really make it and dominate the others. And that is the case in 8 out of 10 culturally heterogeneous states. And I think academics, politicians, educators should do their best to help create in as many states as possible the insight that preemptive conflict regulation is better than conflict. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you so much for this brief yet fascinating overview, which has set the backdrop to our discussions. So we will now delve into the case studies. The second presentation by Professor Michael Kerr looks at potential lessons that could be derived from post-conflict societies with emphasis on Northern Ireland, I believe. So allow me to introduce Professor Michael Kerr. I hope I do justice. So he's the head of the Department of Middle Eastern Studies, director of the Center for the Study of Divided Societies, and professor of conflict studies at King's College. His research interests revolve around power sharing and third-party intervention in divided societies, peace processes, and around the case studies of Lebanon, Syria, Iran, and Northern Ireland. I would like to draw your attention to his very insightful book, which I keep as a precious resource in all of my syllabi, actually, Lebanon, Northern Ireland, Imposing Power Sharing, Conflict and Coexistence in Northern Ireland and Lebanon. Thank you. The floor is all yours.
Thank you, Tamaris. Thank you very much, and thank you, Achim, for inviting me to be here this afternoon with you to celebrate the 50th anniversary of your foundation in Beirut. It's a real pleasure, and a great pleasure to be on a panel with old colleagues and friends, Theo and Karim. As you can tell from my accent, I come from a deeply divided society where people do not want to share power. As Theo just said, his remarks on uniformity reminded me of something that John Major said whenever the Brexit referendum was being held in the United Kingdom. He said, if people want sovereignty, they can go and live in North Korea. Well, if they want uniformity, they can go and live in North Korea as well. But in a society divided by ethnic, linguistic, religious, nationalist divisions such as Lebanon or Northern Ireland, we can't live in the 21st century detached from reality. We must coexist. And the parties to the conflict in Northern Ireland, where I'm from, the majority of them have spent the large part of the last 40 years trying to do the opposite of what the Lebanese have been doing since the 1920s and 40s, and that is attempting to peaceably coexist through a form of power-sharing government. But my task is to talk about dialogue and how dialogue led us to the success. I think in the 70s people looked at Northern Ireland and Lebanon as the hard cases of conflicts that were beyond most people's comprehension, that were a throwback to the 17th century. In the 21st century, they seem, to, on reflection, to be much more of a portent of things to come, sadly. So how we bridge divisions and how we, through dialogue, emerge in a peaceful solution through some sort of power-sharing government is very important for learning and thinking about some of the civil wars that are taking place in the region and beyond at present. So Achim has asked me to consider some of the factors that facilitated dialogue during Northern Ireland's conflict, which lasted from 1969 to 1998, and the role that dialogue played in bringing together the different participants to that conflict. To answer that question, I'll say a few things about the role of dialogue between the British and Irish governments, because they're really, apart from the actors on the ground, the most important brokers of peace. The Northern Ireland paramilitary groups, because you couldn't have an end to the conflict without a cessation of hostilities, making a peace process much easier. And the lack of cross-cutting cleavages in Northern Ireland society, meeting points, cultural and social meeting points between the different communities, and also the role that the positive role that some religious players took in making peace behind the scenes. And I don't mean to say that all religious leaders were positive. Some of you will probably be old enough to remember the Reverend Ian Paisley, who was a prominent religious leader in Northern Ireland, and I don't think he engaged in the sort of discourse or dialogue that would lead to a settlement of anything peaceably until his very last years. The first thing to note in comparison to Lebanon is that when the Northern Ireland conflict erupted in the 1960s, there was no culture of dialogue between the majority Unionist Protestant community and its political leadership and the minority Catholic nationalist community. There was no socialization process or processes that connected the two communities in conflict. Unlike Lebanon prior to the 1970s, Northern Ireland had no history or culture of power sharing at any level within society, and there was nothing to facilitate dialogue at an elite level, never mind at lower levels of society. There was no culture of political coexistence. So the Troubles broke out in 1969 in the absence of dialogue. And this was really very evident in the British government's reaction and its first efforts to draw violence to an end in the early 1970s and create a peace process that would lead to a new form of government, i.e. a form of government that would ensure that Northern Ireland was never governed again by one community through majority rule, which is the way the Unionist community had managed to rule since the 1920s. A large part of the problem was that the British government had basically, almost entirely ignored Northern Ireland since it was partitioned from the Free State of Ireland, and the Northern Ireland government was established in the early 1920s. So when the Troubles broke out, the British had no expertise whatsoever on Northern Ireland in the Home Office, in their civil service, while the Irish government, in contrast, was constitutionally obliged to further the Republic of Ireland's irredentist claim to Northern Ireland and push for Irish unification, and the Troubles presented an opportunity for them to do that. Ironically, whenever Northern Ireland's first Secretary of State, William Whitelaw, was appointed in 1972, following the suspension of the Unionist Parliament in Northern Ireland, members of his diplomatic team, through British intelligence, had been working in Beirut in the late 1960s, before the Civil War, and they suggested to the Secretary of State that if Lebanon's communities could live together peaceably through a power-sharing system, why on earth could Protestants and Catholics in insignificant Northern Ireland not do the same? So perhaps Lebanon was slightly or partly responsible for what eventually was achieved through the Belfast Agreement in 1998, however accidentally. But Northern Ireland's first experience of power-sharing in the 70s didn't go well. It occurred 5 years after the start of the Troubles, and it was largely imposed by the British government. However, the first Northern Ireland executive that brought Protestants and Catholics together in government was overthrown by paramilitary organisations 5 months after it took office, and it took the British government 25 years to get the politicians that formed that government, the parties that formed that government, to return to that form of for that system of conflict regulation, not dissimilar to the Lebanese Civil War experience. It is worth noting here, however, that the paramilitaries overthrew that government partly because it was working quite well. Politicians that had never spoken to each other before were working well in government, and there was no howl of protest, there was no public outcry against the concept or the idea of power sharing. So dialogue did pay political dividends. Continuing dialogue between the British and Irish governments was key to ending the Troubles and a return to power sharing in 1998. While the two governments were completely at odds in the 1970s, by the 1990s, they had really begun working with a unity of purpose. So imagine that on an international level concerning Lebanon's political turmoils. The external parties to the conflict were working with a unity of purpose in bringing the parties to the conflict to accept a power-sharing accord, to accept compromise. Crucially, many of the same diplomats and civil servants who did not know each other in the 1970s had been working with each other for about 25 years, so institutional memory was quite important there. Trust and a clear understanding of one another's positions on the conflict was established during the latter years of conflict. Friendships were forged, lines of communication were kept open, and officials dusted off papers from failed political initiatives and tried again and again. Many of those individuals involved at the civil service level realised early on that there wasn't going to be any other compromise to the Northern Ireland conflict. There wasn't going to be any other result other than a return to power sharing, although many politicians were slow to accept that. The role of the British and Irish intelligence communities was also very important, as they kept alive dialogue with different key participants in the conflict as violence continued. They were constantly talking to the paramilitary organisations on the ground, and the British government infiltrated most at a high level of the Protestant and Catholic paramilitary groups during the 1970s and 80s, and this considerably restrained their military traction. This dialogue was very important in ending the conflict and bringing about paramilitary ceasefires in the 1990s, a cessation of violence that paved the way for political and constitutional settlements. For example, the British government were talking to key provisional IRA leaders as early as the 1970s, Gerry Adams and Martin McGuinness. And the secret back channels that were opened by the intelligence community then were reignited in the 1980s during the Northern Ireland hunger strikes and at the end of Margaret Thatcher's tenure as Prime Minister in the 1980s. And this was a dialogue that it helped enable Sinn Féin and the IRA to participate in the peace process in the 1990s. The role of Catholic priests was particularly salient here, as trusted clergy facilitated dialogue through a secret talks process between British government officials and the IRA. The church was a safe place for dialogue to take place, outside was not. In bringing the Protestant paramilitaries to end their violence and declare a ceasefire, again, the role of religious leaders was absolutely crucial. They simply didn't trust anybody else. They didn't trust their own politicians. They didn't trust the British government, and they certainly didn't trust the Irish government. For example, the head of the Protestant Church of Ireland acted as a broker and a negotiator between the UK Prime Minister John Major and the Irish Prime Minister Albert Reynolds. Through this dialogue, trust was established. Key messages were exchanged between paramilitary organisations and government, and the concerns of the paramilitary leaders were fed into the political process. This led them to declare lasting ceasefires and subsequently agreement, and it also led them to form political parties, politicise and take part in elections. So significant was this dialogue that one Protestant clergyman that I came to know whenever I was a PhD researcher ended up attending the Army Council of the main Protestant paramilitary organisation to provide political advice on the peace process throughout the crucial years. Those militants simply wouldn't have understood all the details of the negotiations, and they trusted someone as an interlocutor to go between government and them, and passing messages back and forth. These secret dialogues were taking place in an atmosphere of violence and mistrust, a time when being seen to be talking to one's enemies could end your political career or erode your legitimacy as a political actor in that peace process. There was no significant cross-community dialogue at a political level between Northern Ireland's parties at this time. The peace process occurred in the absence of trust between the leaders of Northern Ireland's main parties. Perhaps this is not that surprising because, unlike Lebanon, Northern Ireland's elites never mixed at all. They did not work or socialise together or live in the same areas. And there were no cross-cutting cultural or social cleavages at an elite level in Northern Ireland. No meeting or connecting points. When I was a student, the professor said there are no cross-cutting cleavages in Northern Ireland. And I put my hand in the air and stupidly said, yes, there are. There's one, and I said that both Protestants and Catholics support Manchester United or Liverpool. And the professor pointed out to me that in East Belfast, Manchester United Supporters Club, you could see the Protestant Manchester United Supporters Club 500 yards down the road on the other side of the city, on the other side of a peace line, and never the twain will meet. There was a joke also in the 1990s that sort of summed up the way the Northern Ireland elites behaved towards the idea of power sharing, and that went, what do Northern Ireland's politicians do when they see light at the end of the tunnel? The answer was they build more tunnel. They weren't interested in talking to each other. So why were these stakeholders eventually interested in dialogue, and what are the key lessons of this peace process that might be worth thinking about from Lebanon's perspective? Most importantly, Northern Ireland had absolutely or practically no significance whatsoever in international relations in geostrategic terms. And by the mid-1990s, British and Irish governments, sort of negotiating in isolation, had established a sort of, as I said, a unity of purpose to end the conflict and establish a power-sharing government. Those British and Irish governments by the 1990s had no ideological views. They'd no overriding selfish strategic interests that might be an impediment to achieving peace. The majority of Northern Ireland's parties at the time were also, after 30 years of violence, looking for a way out, having largely accepted that some form of compromise was in their best interests, as they had zero chance of achieving their primary goals. There was a stalemate. For hardline nationalists, and they were never going to achieve a united Ireland without the consent of the Protestant community in Northern Ireland. And for the Protestant community, for the hardliners that sought a return to majority rule in Northern Ireland, given demographic shifts in favour of the Catholic community since the 1960s, and the fact that the British government had ruled this out as a policy as far back as 1973, this was also not an option. Internationally, again, thinking about the Middle East and how unlikely this is, the US played a very positive neutral role, acting as honest broker in chairing Northern Ireland's peace negotiations and talks and facilitating dialogue between the different political parties. And there were no international spoilers disrupting that process. Northern Ireland's situation in this respect was the exact opposite of Lebanon's experience in the 1970s and 80s, or Syria today for that matter, where a multitude of regional and international actors do hold selfish strategic or economic interests in the country and the outcome of your civil war, and they were prepared to pursue those interests at the expense of dialogue and at the expense of a political process that might lead to the permanent cessation of those hostilities that favoured the Lebanese. To my mind, this is one of the key problems for Lebanon. There was dialogue in 1975, 1976 when the war broke out, and it was a dialogue that established the basic parameters of the internal agreement that ended Lebanon's civil war at Taif in 1989. However, the parties that reached agreement under the constitutional document in 1976 had no power to implement its provisions. And although there was accord momentarily between the United States and Syria over Lebanon regarding their mutual desire to contain the PLO in Lebanon, Syria's intervention obviously did not lead to the restoration of power sharing and to an end to the conflict until the Cold War ended. In Syria today, sadly, the opposite seems to be the case. There was no dialogue prior to the uprising that might have convinced the regime to compromise. There was no motivating international pressures to convince it to compromise. The opposite was true. The regime dismissed the Damascus Spring and rejected any notion of political reform. The democratic voices that were heard from moderate Sunni, Alawi, Christian leaders and were heard loud and clear in the middle of 2011 were quickly drowned out by mutually reinforcing sectarian narratives as the civil war really erupted and set in. And sadly, I think meaningful dialogue at an international level will remain elusive on Syria, unless there is a complete realignment in international and the international actors that are fighting in Syria, and the parameters of what a settlement to the civil war might be become set, because they were obvious in Lebanon and Northern Ireland, very close to the beginning of those conflicts. But they are not obvious in Syria, and there is much still to fight for, and most parties to the conflict have not put their efforts into resolving the war through diplomacy and dialogue. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I particularly liked how you concretely showed how the politics of dialogue was crucial to create a consensus around power sharing, despite the fact that there were weak cross-cutting cleavages, as you put it. And I was wondering whether we could talk about the requisites for power sharing here when it comes to Lebanon. So despite elite socialization with each other and the existence of cross-cutting cleavages, dialogue in the last years has not bred to clear policy outputs. Rather, power sharing has been in a perpetual state of frozenness, if I might put it that way. Okay, so the third and last presentation will move us to Bosnia, which is a contested yet very insightful example of power sharing arrangements. Professor Karim Mufti teaches at La Sagesse Law School in Beirut and at the University of Saint Joseph, and he has further been collaborating for the last decade with various international organizations, research centers, and think tanks in the fields of human rights, youth empowerment, and social development. Karim, I look forward to hearing about Bosnia.
Thank you, Tamiras. Hello, everybody. It's a real honor to be here. Thank you to the Civil Center for National Initiative and the Friedrich Ebert Stiftung, which I congratulate for the 50 years of effort in Lebanon and keeping a steady ship despite everything. I was invited to speak about one of my favorite topics when it comes to power sharing arrangements, of course, which is the case of Bosnia-Herzegovina, which broke down when Yugoslavia broke down back in the 90s. It's a very fascinating country, and I had the privilege of working on comparing state building in Lebanon and Bosnia-Herzegovina for many years. And so when it comes to the art of dialogue, art of compromise, or how to lead to power sharing, I think Bosnia is a must in any intellectual exercise related to dialogue and state building. And to pick up on what Professor Hanf was saying about you first try to kill your rival and then you talk to him, I think there's a very interesting essay by civil war expert, the French scholar Jean Annoyer, who used to say, to talk peace, you have to first talk war. And usually in many civil wars and many pre-power sharing arrangements, pre-negotiations, peace talks, you will always, unfortunately, find this ethnic cleansing mentality and culture in a way to try and build a state, a nation, a framework that is suitable to a specific ideology, be it related to religion or nationality or nationalism, and so forth. So when we look at Bosnia-Herzegovina, many say it's actually a smaller version of Yugoslavia. Xavier Bugarel says in every conference of his that if you cry for Bosnia, you need to cry for Yugoslavia, because it's basically the breakdown of the Yugoslav issues, the nation, the nations, the people's component of Yugoslavia, who basically happened to live together in Bosnia. And so when Yugoslavia broke down in 1991 and war started in Bosnia, it was obviously because people didn't want to live together anymore. Slovenia declared independence, Croatia declared independence, Bosnia held a referendum in February 1992 in order to declare its independence also, claiming it will have room for all. The Bosniaks, who are the Islamic population of Bosnia, and the Croats, the Bosnian Croats, voted in favor of that referendum, and the Serbs, the Bosnian Serbs, the Serbs of Bosnia, they boycotted this particular referendum. Civil war broke down, and you needed at least 3.5 years for the international community, for the local stakeholders to agree on a peace agreement with, of course, a new institutional/constitutional framework for the country. Eventually, to try and achieve peace, achieving stability, reconciliation, reconstruction, an entire agenda, of course, which is still work in progress today. So this particular case of Bosnia, where the stakeholders, the warring parties, the belligerents, whether the Bosniaks or the Croats and the Serbs, who had their militias, they had their armies, we're talking about 150,000 people killed, and practically a third of the time frame of the Lebanese war, for instance. Why? Because you had the Yugoslav army, you had the Serb army, you have militias involved, and of course it was not easy to stop the war. But in November, December 1995, international brokers, regional brokers intervened and managed to negotiate a kind of deal. It wasn't the first attempt. If I remember correctly, I think it was the third or the fourth attempt, depending on, of course, the developments in the military developments in the field. You had the influence of regional and international powers to reach what is now known officially as the Dayton-Paris Agreement. So this agreement, of course, had to recognize the existence of three national components within Bosnia, which are the Muslims, the Bosniaks, who are 52% of the population, the Serbs, 35.1%, who are Orthodox of confession, and the Croats, 12.3% of the population who are Catholic. So obviously, a plural society has emerged from this war as Bosnia-Herzegovina, claiming itself as a multinational country. So what's interesting is Bosnia is we are even beyond the multi-ethnic framework. We are constitutionally speaking, legally speaking, politically speaking, in what they claim is a multinational state. And in this very complex configuration, knowing that usually state building and nation building are very much connected, how can we build a state for three nations? And of course, it was very challenging. And Dayton, when you read the Dayton Agreement and when you see the system that they envisaged, something you would think no human mind can come up with. And I would need the entire board to show you just how the Bosnian political system works. So this divided society has, of course, through this negotiated deal, has led to a very, very fragmented political system, what experts would call an asymmetrical federation. Asymmetrical federation because it's a federation within a federation. So Bosnia is a federal state, and it has two entities. You have the Muslim Croat Federation, that is itself divided into 10 cantons. Each canton has its own government. Each canton, so let's calculate together the number of governments just in Bosnia alone. The east part of Bosnia, 49%, covering 49% of the territory, is the Republika Srpska, obviously the Serbian part of the country, that is broken down not into cantons but into municipalities. There is a central state that is supposed to, do the integration, political integration of both entities at a central level. It's a very, very weak central state, even though the last 15 years was a huge effort, huge mobilization from the international state builders, from a few stakeholders within Bosnia, we'll talk about them in a moment, to reinforce the state with this belief that the stronger the central state is, the more social link will be created, the more integrated the population can be, and the more tolerance can be instigated, which of course did not really happen as planned. So power sharing, of course, has been integrated in the system. You have a tripartite presidency, meaning it's not one president, you have a system of three presidents, each representing its own nation or people, And of course, there is absolutely no coordination, or used to be back in the 90s after Dayton. There was no coordination whatsoever. Whenever they wanted to have a meeting in Sarajevo, you'd have the Komsilic, the Serbian member, for instance, who would say, no, I would not go to Sarajevo. And Alija Izetbegovic, that you all know, would be very relieved to know that the Serbian member who was part of the militia that used to bomb Sarajevo when it was surrounded for 3 years, he'd be, of course, very relieved vis-a-vis his own base that this particular individual does not set foot in Sarajevo. So, of course, after Dayton, you would say that dialogue maybe stopped a bit. To add to the complexity, because, of course, the international stakeholders understood that if you would let this Bosnian monstrous institutional setup alone, it would collapse. And so you have a huge period of international institution building or international state building, with the setup of what was called the Peace Implementation Committee that represents all of Europe, European Union, Russia, United States, NATO, and the regional stakeholders, FRY back then, the Federal Republic of Yugoslavia, before it itself disintegrated into Serbia, Montenegro, and now Serbia and Montenegro are independent. So things did not last very long on that front. And they instituted what we call a high representative, meaning some kind of high commissionary that has the bond powers. Bond powers are the powers to overrule, overturn, disqualify, dismiss any local leader. And the level of power this particular international individual had, along with NATO presence, 50,000 troops back then, with the implementation force, with the stabilization force afterwards, the EU, the UN. So you had a huge amount of effort and investment from the international state builders that, of course, tried to lead on the dialogue, to implement the power sharing agreement, because, of course, as everyone agrees around this table, nobody wanted to share power, especially at that stage of the deal. So they were in charge of, so the high representative was in charge of trying to bring the forces together, bring dialogue together, believing that strengthening the central state will actually reduce the pressure from the nationalist project. As I said, this vision failed. And you have all this debate around the question of, is the Bosnian, not the Bosniak, the Bosnian state, is it really, does it really have solid foundation? Can we consider it as a failed state? As we know, the state is not able to protect and promote this, what they call in Bosnia, the komsiluk. Komsiluk is in Arabic, al-aish al-mushtarak, coexistence, which is closer to a neighborhood agreement, the good neighborhood agreements, than the real cross-cutting socialization kind of way. But even that is in danger in Bosnia in 1996, 1997. And to put it in the words of Simonetta Taboni, there's a huge battle between the contractual spirit, the spirit that will allow to find bridges of cooperation, collaborate, find solutions, work within the power sharing agreements to provide solutions for the different communities, and the ethnic spirit, which is the one that is actually that has the high hand in Bosnia-Herzegovina. So, and this was the price to pay, this monstrous institutional setup. This was the price to pay for the war to end. So Dayton and the negotiations around it had, of course, its share of advantage, because it actually restored peace. It did restore stability. Then comes the question of reconstruction, political reconstruction, economic reconstruction, and, of course, the issue of reconciliation and justice. Peace and stability was okay because it was led on by the High Representative, the EU, the NATO. And the EU and NATO are actually the lantern that keeps Bosnia from collapsing, that keeps Bosnia from disintegrating, because the EU offers the Stability and Association Pact, which Bosnia integrated back in 2008. NATO also offers this really shiny, nice packaged gift of collaboration with NATO, which is the PFP, the Partnership for Peace, and the Membership Agreement Partnership. Both Bosnia acceded to them back in 2006, 2010. But in parallel, when you look at Bosnia after 1995, 1996, elections occurred. And who won the elections, of course? Those who were leading ethnic cleansing, those who were leading on genocide. These are the people who reached power. Ethnic mobilization did not stop. Alija Izetbegovic was leading for the Bošnjak interest. Tudjman from Croatia was influencing the same party, HDZ, it's the same name, same party in Bosnia. The Serbs were having trouble finding right representatives because you have a foreign agent called the International Criminal Tribunal for ex-Yugoslavia that actually interfered and actually did a lot of interference with the political context by grabbing one after one the different wanted war criminals. So, for instance, the High Commissioner, the High Representative, had to dismiss the President of the Republika Srpska. She was convicted of war crimes. He had to dismiss the very first Bosnian member of the tripartite presidency of the central state, Krajišnik. He was also dismissed, and he was sentenced back in 2010, 26 years of prison for his role in bombing Sarajevo. So, of course, dialogue didn't compensate with the Dayton Agreement and the implementation of the Dayton Agreement. It didn't compensate for the lack of confidence. To paraphrase the very first High Representative report in 1996, Carl Bildt, he says, stronger political measures should have been taken by the Bosnian authorities to win Serb confidence in their commitment to a multi-ethnic Sarajevo, because they were kicked out. The Serbs were kicked out of Sarajevo and they were prevented from coming back in, and encourage such communities to stay. There has also been irresponsible propaganda by key Republika Srpska personalities advocating ethnic division of the country. Krajišnik, for instance, before being arrested, he would always state the Serbs in Sarajevo will not accept Muslim rule, also a rejection of the system. The Croats with the HDZ, the Nationalist Croat Party, they fought for more than 12, 15 years this idea of Herceg Bosna, which is the central part of the federation, where Croats live in majority, and they wanted to have self-determination there and maybe independence. So this also was pressure from within. The Serbs in the very much autonomous Republika Srpska, where today 96% of the Serbs live there, they prevented and made it very difficult for other communities to come back. Milorad Dodik, who used to be prime minister of the entity, who is now the president of the entity, he regularly threatens everyone with the referendum for secession of Republika Srpska, getting away from Bosnia. And the last attempt was in September last month. So again, it was postponed. As always, he was threatened by the High Representatives. And this High Representative, he's the guy actually in charge of cohesion building, of consensus building. And whenever there is a decision made back in 1995, 1996, whether it's, and it's really funny because if you have unified phone lines, unified car registration system, if you had civil aviation, the same currency, it's thanks to the High Representative, because the different political elites from the different communities did not want to build this country together. Freedom of movement was imposed by NATO. They removed the checkpoints within a few months of Dayton. Again, this was not done by cooperation by the Bosnian elites. So the inter-entity boundary line, which is the frontier, the internal frontier that delimits the two federations, the two entities, this was also done mani militari by NATO and the High Representative. And so the High Representative is managing these conflicting national projects that is not supposed to be his job, but he was taken there. And one needs to observe that these conflicting national projects did not die or were not buried with the end of the war. Another quote from Carl Bildt again, back in 1996, he's reporting on the 1996 years, and he said, well, I reported on the disturbing trend towards ethnic separation. I regret to say that I see no fundamental improvement in this situation. So this is 1 year after the signing of the Dayton Agreement. So despite that, there were some initiatives. So if the door of dialogue is shut, you open some kind of window. And windows were open. There are interesting success stories. Back in 1998, Sarajevo was trying to be the city of tolerance. They had this huge conference with all this international presence, wanting to be the multi-ethnic model of tolerance. Of course, it didn't go very far, but there was some kind of stakeholders, a category of stakeholders that wanted to bring the country together and bring the communities closer together. On a political level, you had 2 years of an interesting alliance called Alliance for a Change, which was led by the Social Democrat Party, who stayed 2 years grabbing the reins of the central state and part of the federation, not Republika Srpska, of course. And this multi-ethnic coalition ran the country. They fought against discrimination. They changed the constitutions. They competed with nationalist parties. They forced dialogue between political forces, and they managed to strengthen with the High Representative some areas of the central state. But yet, they never really managed to build a sustainable momentum for a sustainable dialogue and cooperation process, despite of the power-sharing agreements. The power-sharing agreements were good to stop the war, but they were not able to create consensus-building culture, which is absent from the Bosnian political culture. So despite the fact that it was led very aggressively by many high representatives, the most aggressive mandate was by the British Paddy Ashdown, who was really out there to get the nationalist. He failed, and he couldn't really address this issue. So instead of these parentheses, a pacified dialogue among nationalist party is there, but it doesn't take away the nationalist contradicting issue. So state building today in Bosnia is still seen as a confiscation process, meaning whoever comes to power will try to confiscate power, will try to confiscate prerogatives in favor of his own nation. So state building is actually has pretty much transformed itself into nation building with 3 objectives: consolidation of rights of the constitutional people, quest or maintaining territory. Republika Srpska is very keen on keeping its hand on the 49% of territory that belong to the Serbs now. And of course, controlling the state's arcanes, controlling the different entity levels, controlling maybe the central state, so that you maintain a proper leverage over the rest of the communities. So a very contrasted landscape in Bosnia, but a lot of lessons to be learned from if you want in the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Karim, for shedding light on the external and institutional aspects that have created a kind of infrastructure for power sharing in Bosnia. In the interest of time, we're going to be brief. So I would like, however, to open the floor for questions, reflections, and comments from the audience. Yes, Rima.
Hello. My name is Rima. I'm assistant professor of sociology. So my comment is more from a sociological perspective, and because it seems that there is a big difference between how we understand societies from a sociological perspective, and then how the discipline of political science and IR jump to the stage of providing solutions. But I mean, I still find some problems with how we diagnose these conflicts. And it seems that we're here conflating many things. So, of course, I mean, divisions exist, and they're real, and sectarianism is a real phenomenon. However, I mean, we don't want to be blind to sectarianism, but we also don't want to be blinded by it. So, I mean, this whole literature on divided societies assumes that there are, I mean, I don't know of any society in the world that is not divided somehow. And then the question becomes, when do these divisions become politicized and deepen and take the shapes that they take? So dealing with the question of political divisions along ethnic or sectarian lines assumes that, and I mean, this is a conflation that is often done in the literature, that sectarian political parties or sectarian leaders represent sects, and then we start analyzing as if sects are in conflict. Whereas, I mean, and especially in the first two presentations, I don't think that it is sociologically accurate to talk of societies divided along sects, because we can find in both, I think, Lebanon, Northern Ireland, but also in other societies that have witnessed conflicts. I mean, of course, there's a conflict that takes a sectarian overturn, but we can't really say that there is nothing else in these societies, and there's absolutely no cross-cutting between the sects or the ethnicities. Or, I mean, there are plenty of examples. It really depends on where we're looking and what we're looking at in society. So, building on the assumption that societies are vertically divided into clear-cut groups that are in conflict, then leads to, I mean, of course, then it will lead to conclusions that consociational democracy, power sharing, etc., are solutions. But my comment or question would be, how about if we take a step back and re-examine, redo the diagnosis of these societies and try to see whether really the problem is, was it a lack of dialogue that has led to these divisions? And I would say no. So if it isn't, then it seems that we're dealing with the consequences of a conflict and not really with the cause of the conflict. And maybe rethinking of what the causes of these conflicts are would be also beneficial in trying to think of solutions. Thank you.
Thank you, Rima. Who would like to is your question addressed to somebody specifically, or was it a general question regarding the, the argumentation line around power sharing, sectarianism, and the conflation between sectarianism and divided societies?
No, I mean, it's general. Whoever.
It's general. Okay. Who would like to? Okay, go. Please, Professor Hunt.
Look, I'm getting always a bit nervous if people speak about sects and sectarianism. What means sects? Sects are small religious groups cut off a bigger organized church. That's what it was in the history of the United States. Now, to call the Sunnis a sect or the Shias a sect or a full blended Oriental church with a long history like the Orthodox or the Maronites a sect is nonsensical. It is, pejorative. It's just in order to take away a certain dignity of a group that one is using these terms. In the Soviet Union, they never spoke about sects. They spoke about nationalities and about nations, which is, of course, almost as nonsensical. The question is, if we fellow sociologists have to ask the question, what knits these people together? What is it? And let me be very provocative. In the Middle East, this is mainly family. It is extended family. If you look into the different groups, whatever their ideology is, if they have a sacred banner or a secular banner, it's basically something which links the interest of people of the same kin. And when people talk about social integration in societies which is made up of very different families, then I can say only with what the French anthropologists always told. The social integration is impossible sans échange de femmes.
Without exchanging women.
This is not a male chauvinism. It is simply the fact that if there is no traffic between families in both directions, then there will be no social integration. So we can glorify a community in Lebanon by calling it a nation. I spent almost the whole summer, some 20 years ago, in reading the newspaper articles written by Karl Marx. Now Karl Marx was definitely did not claim to be a specialist in Lebanon. But there were two characterizations which I found very interesting. In one place he speaks about the savage tribes of Mount Lebanon. And in another one, he speaks about the nations of Mount Lebanon. Mm. So this shows simply a depiction of the same phenomenon by pejorative or by glorifying terms. And I think what we should do in political sociology is to ask what makes these people of a different group believe that they are one group and that they are better than other groups and that they should be different and so on and so forth, whatever the flag. Mm. Okay. Now, just to be a bit more provocative, sometimes I told my students here at AUB, imagine by tomorrow there would be no communities anymore. No Druses, Maronites, Alawites, and so on and so forth. There would be only Buddhists. Don't you think that there will still be the Buddhists of Tripoli and of Saida and of Jebel and Bin Jebel? I'll leave it at that.
Thank you. Yes, please, Professor Kerr.
In Northern Ireland, I mean, again, I think, following on from what Theo said, the use of the word sect is a bit of a misnomer, because it doesn't matter what Protestant sect you come from. Religion is really just an ethnic marker for describing two deeply ethnicized communities whose core political values and nationalist values are diametrically opposed. I am a Manchester United fan, and my best friend is a Catholic, and he's a Manchester United fan. But we met in London, and we've never watched a game of football together in Northern Ireland. That wasn't possible when I was growing up. It probably is today. And those two identities that I'm talking about, through a power sharing initiative and a new constitutional dispensation, it has opened up the space for different identities. So if you did a poll tomorrow in Northern Ireland and asked people their identity, a considerable proportion of the population would say Northern Irish first, rather than Unionist or Nationalist. Protestant, I mean, which were almost synonymous with Protestant or Catholic during the conflict, because that space now exists within society for that to happen. To give you another example, when I was a PhD student in my second year of my PhD, I met a senior Sinn Féin negotiator. He was not somebody who was a member of the IRA in the past, but he was a senior Sinn Féin negotiator at a function. And I asked him for an interview for my thesis. And he said, sure. He was a bit surprised, knowing where I came from, because I worked for somebody who was from a different political party at the time, who wouldn't have shared his core values or views. And he said, sure, come and see me in Londonderry in a couple of weeks' time. So I travelled there, and I got a taxi to the Sinn Féin office in the Bogside, which was not really a safe place for me to go where I was coming from at that time. And before we had our interview, he said to me, "Do you mind if some of my colleagues join us?" And I said no. And he phoned downstairs, and then I heard the feet on the stairs, and 7 or 8 men came up and sat in a semicircle beside us and listened to our discussion. They'd never met a Protestant before, never mind a Unionist person in their office in Derry. That's how polarised the Northern Ireland conflict was. So there was no space to think outside. I wouldn't use the word sect, but outside that ethno-national framework.
Any other question? Yes, please.
Perhaps in the history of Lebanon, the largest religious community demographically had attempted or dreamed of dominating. And perhaps the last arrival on the scene of hopes and desire of dominating is perhaps the Shia community. The question is perhaps for Professor Humph. There are 2 perspectives here. One perspective that says the Hezbollah, the largest armed force in Lebanon, is just trying to improve its shares, and it does believe in power sharing. And the second perspective believes that actually the Hezbollah does not believe in power sharing, and it's just postponing the project of dominating. So what do you think?
Look,
Tricky question.
yes, no, the danger is, or the difficulty is to give a correct answer, which is also short. I certainly failed. Pardon?
They're asking if you could raise your voice because someone...
Yeah, let me try again. Germany has been for centuries a deeply divided country. There are books on the confessional century in Germany. Well, it was after all in the heart of Europe that the 30 Years' War has taken place, where all in all 1/3 of the population was killed, and in some parts of the country more than half. And then when everybody was exhausted, they produced a confessional constitution, namely the Peace Treaty of Westphalia, which is not very well known here, but it has many comparable aspects to the Taif document. In Taif, you have veto power of 1/3 in the cabinet. In the Westphalian constitution, there was what they called in good Latin, at the time the official language, itio in partes. If one group declared a question, whatever question, as being of confessional status, then the parliament had to split in a Protestant and in a Catholic parliament. And only if there were majorities in both parliaments, the bill was voted. Now, since this was always very heavy-handed, people started to bargain. I have that bill, and I know you want to veto it, then I'll veto your next bill. There's a whole political language which still exists in Austria. It is more developed even than in Germany. Paktieren, you make a parcel, and then they negotiate whole parcels. But you could declare any item in the political agenda as of status confessionis, whether it was taxes or military service and so on. If somebody got up and said status confessionis, then they had either to strike a deal or to go into the split parliament. And this has pushed whole sectors of the Central European population into a mode of collective bargaining. of trade unions and employers, the relations of which are far less confrontational than in other European countries, about schooling, about various sectors where one had to bargain. That's why the German political scientist Gerhard Lehmbruch, he doesn't like to speak so much about consociationalism. He speaks about bargaining democracy, negotiating democracy. Now, what is this today? Before the war, in Germany, about 5% of marriages were biconfessional marriages. Then, after the end of the war, there was the big ethnic cleansing of the East Germans from Prussia, from Pomerania, from Silesia, from the Sudeten parts of the Bohemian Republic. 12 million people were sent elsewhere. And as it happened, there was no plan, and there even has not been somebody coming forward with a conspiracy theory that Protestants ended up in Catholic areas and Catholics in Protestant areas. In Schleswig-Holstein, in the north of Germany, they had not seen a Catholic since Martin Luther's time, and now they have 10%. A friend of mine was a young parish priest at the Belgian border in a place called Kalte Herberg, a village of some 6,000 souls, and they have always been Catholic since Christianity was introduced in Germany. And then he found out in the first weeks that people wanted to convert to Catholicism. And he said, but why? What are you? Well, I'm a Lutheran. Well, that's okay, but what's wrong with Lutheranism? I don't want to push you back. But tell me, you must have a reason. Of course, the man didn't have a reason. So my friend was looking into the papers, the files of his predecessor, and he found that there were mixed marriages, something between 20 and 30, since 1944. And the reason, which was always indicated in the book, was wants to remain in Kalte Herberg. In order to remain there, in order to marry a girl from the village, they were prepared to convert. You have similar things in Lebanese history. And from the 60s onwards, there was no conversion anymore for mixed denominational marriage. They just married. And now you have 1/3 of the Germans who don't marry anymore. And you have about 37.5% of mixed marriages, denominationally mixed marriages. That means that one generation to come, children born of an average German marriage will have to make up whether they choose to be Protestant or Catholic or nothing. And the number of those who decide nothing is on the increase. So confessionalism is not anymore a real issue in German politics. To simplify the whole thing is, as long as belonging to a particular group, to a confession or a sect or a community, as long as it is linked with advantages or disadvantages, then the society runs in trouble. Only if there is equal access to positions considered as desirable, then the characteristic of belonging to a particular group doesn't matter anymore. Sorry, this was perhaps correct, but too long.
And this was allegorical. Yes, it was telling. Okay, we take one last question in the interest of time. Yes, please.
Hello, I'm Hassan Krayem, political scientist and practitioner of governance. Just to follow on the discussion or dialogue, actually, that's taking place in the room. There is a very big distinction and a problem when we deal with the divided societies from the perspective, first of all, that all societies are divided. I think we have acknowledged this, but from the perspective of the dynamic and static mechanism. If we take it from the whatever division for itself, this would create a static situation. If we take it from the perspective of the political or politicization of the divisions, then it will become dynamic. Most societies would have some sort of alternation of power, unless it is a very authoritarian system. But most of the democratic system, let's say, have alternation of power, and that is in itself is power sharing. Power sharing, but recognized politically. When we put groups in a static situation and we say Christians, Muslims, Hindus, whatever, lingual or ethnic or sectarian, then we're assuming that this situation should remain the same. And we know for sure that, like Professor just mentioned, that life is not static, that things will change, that the demography is changing, that the social conditions are changing, culture is changing. So what we have, or what we end up with, a formula that is unstable for sure. By the way, power sharing is a formula, and that's the work of Arndt Liphart with all the criteria for this formula, but it proved to be everywhere a very unstable formula because it assumes things to remain stable or static while life is presenting itself as always changing and balance of forces are changing. Take Lebanon, for instance. No Lebanese can remember a stable time. They think that's Lebanon that we know. It's always unstable. 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, 2000, 2016 now, because it is the rule of the game when you have such a situation that cannot be fixed. It has to be always changing. So the National Pact of 1943 is no longer acceptable, and the status of the groups that were in 1943 accepting such formula between two communities are no longer there in society, and they want something different, something radically different. So what do? You have always, a new born political formula, a new born political system, or, which should not be ignored, you have a secular system. Europe, all of Europe, regardless of the divisions, are operating under secularism. And there is a secular ethics, secular culture, secular practices in politics. It doesn't matter if one would like to get married a Catholic and change to Catholic. What matters is he's going to vote for political parties. He's going to be considered an equal citizen to everybody else. He's going to be treated equally, and that's the secular culture and secular ethics.
Where do you find it? Can you tell me a country, a political system where you have such a secular system?
Can you give him the example of a political system worldwide where secularism has really succeeded?
Why the United States, that has all kinds of divisions, is able to continue in a stable manner? Why the Israelis are able to tolerate Sephardim and Ashkenaz, and others are not able to tolerate Catholics and Protestants?
I didn't get the point, sorry. acoustically.
I just think that the purpose of the panel is not to compare or generalize experiences, but rather just to focus on the politics of dialogue and how it takes shape differently under different circumstances. In the interest of the time, I don't think we would have the time to delve into such different experiences. But I think that if you would like to react to Hassan's comment, any of you, on why power sharing can be, like a block sometimes to the transformation of society, and in the sense that it freezes and crystallizes cleavages, and how this can be overcome.
Yeah, I recognize many of the things that you say, and you could just turn the glass a different way and look at it half full. Lebanon has a formula, a system, as you've described. And if you look back at the history of the Middle East in the 20th century, Lebanon's formula of government is more enduring than practically any other form of government in the region. It goes back to the 1920s, and it survived a civil war. And who thought it would outlast the Central Arab Nationalist Ba'athist states of Syria and Iraq? They're not going to be put back together. The question is, I think maybe in 20 or 30 or 40 years' time, can Lebanon organically develop into a political system that is more like the Netherlands than it is like Bosnia or like Lebanon today? Well, that's not just up to the Lebanese. The Lebanese cannot determine that, because the politics of power sharing in Lebanon are so closely linked to the region and to foreign patrons and the ups and downs of international relations that affect this neutral, weak state. But the good news is, I think that the state endures. And to go back to if I may, to your question, this is a question that was constantly asked in the Northern Ireland peace process about Sinn Féin and the IRA, with respect to what you asked about Hezbollah. If we engage, if we share power with them, if they're in government, will they then not seek their ideological goals through force and democracy rather than just force? But of course, having engaged in a political process, they invested all of their political capital in that process, and they learnt things, even though they would be defined in those days as a terrorist organisation by the majority of one community. They learnt things from the political process, from dialogue, from engagement. On one hand, they knew that they couldn't get their ideological goals either diplomatically or through violence, but that they could actually get a lot more or something else and gain a lot through political participation. If the answer to the latter part of your question is yes, and Hezbollah has the same ideological goals as it did in 1985, and it's as set out in its manifesto, then it has learnt nothing from the Lebanese experience of the 20th century. It has learnt nothing from the Civil War and the post-Civil War period, because Lebanon has had different experiences of power sharing. One is power sharing under a mandate system. Two is independence. There was elements of power sharing during the Civil War with different power sharing governments. Three, power sharing by proxy from Damascus during Syrian hegemony up until 2005, and now a period of continued flux. Perhaps Hezbollah has learnt nothing from any of those experiences. I think the real question is, the problem for Hezbollah is that, like the other communities that you're talking about that had hegemonic projects, whether they were independence projects or dominating projects, they too have broken Lebanon's national pact in engaging in a conflict outside Lebanon on behalf of whichever part of the Lebanese society they speak for, because that's broken Lebanon's neutrality. And whenever Lebanon's neutrality was broken in the past, it led to civil war.
Thank you so much. I've been told that we have to stop here, unfortunately, due to the schedule. So I'm sorry that we couldn't take other questions because the topic lends itself to many interpretations. Karim would just like to close with a final remark, if you do not mind, and then we move to the last panel of the conference.
Yes, very, very quickly on this issue, the question of whether power sharing produces stability. I think when you look at that, you have two phases of power sharing. You have the power sharing when you look at the mentality, and Lebanon has it, even though power sharing in Lebanon is no longer producing stability, power sharing in Bosnia is no longer producing stability, but there is no violence, there is no outbreak of war. So whether power sharing is embedded in institutions like Bosnia, because they need institutions for sustaining the peace deal, or whether it's embedded in the mentality. For Lebanon, for instance, the institutions are completely crumbling. There's no resorting to institution. They have even created a parallel institution, which is Tawlat al-Hawar, which doesn't exist in any constitution, no longer resorting parliament, in order to implement the power sharing. So whatever the perspective here, I think the stability is always a key point to keep in mind. Thank you. Sorry, Doctor.
We will continue the discussion over the coffee break. We'll continue the discussion over the coffee break, hopefully.